They said the lowest level of Castle Blackthorne was never mapped for a reason, and anyone who tried to count its steps never came back the same in their memories. But Emily Carter had learned long ago that the most dangerous places in the world were not always the loud ones. They were the ones that stayed quiet too long. At just past midnight, she stood alone at the edge of the service stairwell with a single oil lantern in her hand, its soft glow trembling against the ancient stone walls as she was ordered to clean what no one else wanted to see. The castle above her slept in gold and candlelight, but down here the air was colder, heavier, like the stone itself remembered everything it had ever heard. Emily adjusted her worn gloves and stepped down carefully, each footfall echoing softly into the unseen depths below. She was an Omega, assigned to invisible work, the kind of existence that required silence more than speech, obedience more than questions, yet even she had learned to notice when silence felt intentional. The corridors narrowed as she descended, the architecture shifting from polished noble stone to older, rough-hewn walls that seemed carved by hands that no longer existed. Somewhere far below, a sound drifted upward, faint but unmistakably human in rhythm, like a voice speaking through distance and time. Emily froze at the bottom step, her lantern swaying slightly as she steadied her breath, listening. "Don't come closer," the voice said again, clearer this time, though it carried no anger, only something quieter, restrained, almost weary. It was not the voice of a guard, nor a prisoner begging for mercy, and that realization made her pulse slow instead of quicken. She should have turned back immediately. That was what every rule in the castle demanded, but rules had never explained why the voice sounded like it already knew she was there. Against her better judgment, Emily moved forward into the corridor, following the sound past iron doors that had not been opened in years, past chains hanging like forgotten symbols rather than tools. The air changed as she walked, growing strangely still, as if even dust refused to settle here. She stopped at a final archway where the lantern light barely reached, revealing only a heavy gate beyond it, and beyond that, the faint outline of something large enough to be mistaken for shadow if one did not look carefully. "I brought water," she said softly, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded in the emptiness. And for a moment there was only silence in return, so complete it felt deliberate, until the voice answered again, closer now, measured, almost cautious. "You should leave," it said, though there was no command in it, only warning shaped like restraint. Emily hesitated, her grip tightening slightly on the lantern handle, because something about the voice did not match the prison it came from, and in that contradiction, curiosity quietly took its first breath. Above them, the castle continued its night, as if nothing beneath it was waiting to be remembered. The silence that followed her words felt heavier than the stone itself, as if the dungeon beneath Castle Blackthorne was listening more closely than it had any right to. Emily Carter stood still with the lantern trembling slightly in her hand, the warm light revealing only the edges of the iron gate and the faint suggestion of movement beyond it. For a moment, she wondered if exhaustion had begun to play tricks on her mind, because no place this deep should feel so aware, so awake. Then the voice came again, quieter this time, as if speaking through distance that no longer felt physical. "You are not supposed to be here," it said, not as a warning this time, but as a statement that carried something almost like curiosity beneath it. Emily swallowed, forcing herself to step closer until the lantern light brushed against the iron bars, revealing a shape seated just beyond them, partially hidden in shadow, but undeniably present. The figure was still, composed, yet carried the weight of something restrained not only by metal, but by time itself. She set the small container of water on the stone floor just outside the gate, careful not to let her hand linger too long, though she did not fully understand why she felt the need for caution. "I was told to ignore anything I hear down here," she said softly, her voice steady but low. "But I do not think you are something meant to be ignored." A pause followed, long enough that she wondered if she had crossed a line she could not see. Then the figure shifted slightly, just enough for the lantern light to catch a glimpse of eyes that reflected it back with unsettling clarity, not animal, not fully human in appearance, but aware in a way that made her breath slow without her permission. "Most people obey that instruction," the voice replied, almost thoughtful now. as if analyzing her rather than responding. Emily crouched slightly, bringing herself closer to the gate without touching it, the stone floor cold beneath her knees. "Most people are not down here at midnight," she answered gently, surprising even herself with a faint trace of calm that did not match the situation. There was a subtle sound then, not a movement of chains or struggle, but something like a controlled breath, as if the presence beyond the gate had been holding still for a long time and was now deciding whether stillness was still necessary. "What is your name?" she asked, though the question felt too personal for a place like this. Yet silence alone had begun to feel more unsettling than curiosity. The figure did not answer immediately, and in that delay Emily noticed something strange, a faint tension in the air that felt less like fear and more like restraint, as if every word spoken here carried consequences that extended beyond the dungeon walls. Finally, the voice responded, low and deliberate. "Names are complicated where I am from." Emily studied the outline beyond the bars, her lantern casting soft light across stone that had clearly been untouched for years. Yet something about him felt less like a prisoner and more like someone choosing not to leave. "Then I will not ask again," she said quietly, though she did not look away. For the first time, there was a pause that felt different, not empty but measured, and when he spoke again, the tone had shifted slightly, less distant, more present. "That would be wise," he said, and in that moment Emily realized the strange certainty growing inside her was not fear at all, but the unsettling feeling that whatever was behind that gate had been waiting for her longer than she had known it existed. Emily Carter took a cautious step back from the gate, her lantern held firmly in both hands as shadows danced across the damp stone walls around her, the quiet of the dungeon pressing in like a soft weight that made every sound she produced echo in unexpected ways. The presence beyond the bars remained motionless for a moment, and then shifted, revealing a larger portion of its form that was both majestic and restrained, as if it carried the memory of centuries in the posture it held. Emily felt a pull in her chest, a quiet curiosity that was neither fear nor expectation but a mixture of concern and wonder, as if the dungeon itself had whispered her name and she had answered without knowing it. She set the lantern down on the floor briefly to wipe her hands across her apron, noticing the cold stone beneath her fingers and the faint scent of old wood and iron lingering in the air, subtle reminders of the castle above and the lives that had passed through this place long before her. "Why are you here?" she asked softly, her voice careful not to startle the quiet presence, though it carried a natural firmness that made even the stone seem to lean closer to listen. The voice answered after a pause, measured, calm, almost contemplative. "Because no one else would come," it said, the tone neither proud nor bitter, simply factual, and Emily found herself nodding slightly, though she was not sure if it was acknowledgement or agreement with the truth it carried. She took a step closer to the gate, careful to keep the lantern between them, as if light alone could bridge the distance between the unknown and her own pulse racing with curiosity. The figure shifted again, leaning slightly forward as if to study her in return, its presence in the dim glow of the lantern revealing eyes that shimmered with an intelligence that seemed almost alive, tracking her every movement, reading hesitation and resolve alike. Emily spoke again, her words gentle, deliberate, choosing the simplest language because she could not measure the effect of more complicated phrasing in a place so charged with anticipation. "I only want to help," she said, placing the small bowl of water slightly closer to the gate so that he could reach it without her needing to move past the threshold, and she noted how the air felt warmer in that brief moment, a subtle shift that made the darkness less daunting. For a long while, only the quiet responded, as if the dungeon itself had paused, and Emily stood frozen with the lantern light flickering against the damp walls, catching glimpses of ancient carvings and symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the corners of her vision. Finally, the presence spoke again, softer this time, almost hesitant, yet deliberate. "You are the first to speak without fear," it said, and in those words, Emily felt a strange reassurance, a silent permission that encouraged her to remain where she was and continue her cautious observation. She shifted slightly to her left, adjusting the lantern so that the soft light illuminated more of the gate, her mind racing with possibilities of who or what lay behind it, wondering how long he had been waiting and why this place seemed to recognize her in ways that the corridors above could never have prepared her for. She knelt briefly to adjust the water bowl, noting that even this small act of care felt significant, almost ceremonial in the hush of the dungeon, and she realized that each careful movement, each deliberate word, was creating a fragile bridge between herself and the unknown presence, one measured gesture at a time. The stillness returned, not oppressive, but expectant, and Emily sensed that the night had stretched itself around them, holding its breath for something that had not yet been revealed, and in that shared pause, she felt the weight of responsibility and the quiet excitement of discovery, as if every second she remained here was shaping a story neither of them fully understood, but both were aware of in its intensity and significance. The quiet inside the dungeon shifted in a subtle but noticeable way, as if the air itself had adjusted to the rhythm of Emily Carter's presence rather than resisting it, and she found herself standing a little longer than she intended near the iron gate, the lantern light steady now in her hands as her breathing slowed into something more controlled and thoughtful. Beyond the bars, the figure remained seated but no longer entirely still, his attention clearly focused on her in a way that felt intentional rather than incidental, as though every movement she made was being observed with quiet precision. Emily lowered herself slightly again, not out of fear but out of a growing sense of steadiness, placing both hands near the lantern so its glow would not waver as much, and she noticed how the shadows responded differently now, less like threats and more like boundaries between two unfamiliar worlds. "You have been down here for a long time," she said softly, her voice carrying a calmness she did not fully recognize in herself, and the figure beyond the gate tilted his head slightly, acknowledging her observation without interrupting it. "Time is different when nothing changes," he replied after a pause, and Emily considered those words carefully, sensing they carried more meaning than their simplicity suggested. She glanced at the water she had placed earlier, noticing it had not been touched, and yet something about the stillness of it made her feel as though it had been part of the conversation all along, waiting for permission rather than need. "Do you not want it?" she asked gently, gesturing toward the container, and for the first time there was something like hesitation in his response, not refusal but reflection. "Want is not always the same as necessity," he said, and Emily frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet thought, because the answer felt like it belonged to someone who had learned to separate himself from simple needs over a long period of isolation. She shifted her weight and leaned slightly closer to the gate, careful to maintain distance, and in doing so she noticed faint markings along the iron, symbols worn down by time, that seemed more ceremonial than structural, as if the gate had once been meant for something far more significant than containment. "This place is not ordinary," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and the figure gave a faint sound that might have been agreement or acknowledgement. "Neither am I," he replied simply, and the words hung in the air with a calm certainty that made Emily pause for a moment longer than she intended. She studied him again, trying to reconcile the stillness of his posture with the weight in his voice, and she felt an unexpected certainty forming, not fully formed into understanding, but enough to suggest that whatever was behind this gate had not been forgotten by the world above, only hidden from it. Emily finally reached forward just enough to slide the water closer through a gap near the base of the iron bars, her fingers stopping short of contact, as if instinct alone warned her to remain where she was, and she noticed how the motion caused the lantern light to flicker across his eyes again, revealing a brief reflection that felt almost like recognition. "If you are not a prisoner," she said carefully, her voice steady but quieter now, "then what are you?" The silence that followed was not empty this time, but deliberate, as if the answer required permission to exist, and when he finally spoke again, his tone carried something deeper than before, something measured and restrained. "That depends on who is asking," he said, and Emily realized then that the conversation had shifted without her noticing, no longer about what lay behind the gate, but about why she had been allowed to find it at all. Emily Carter remained still for a moment after his last words, feeling the weight of the silence settle differently now, no longer empty, but layered with something she could not easily name. The lantern in her hand cast a steady circle of light across the iron gate, revealing every texture of age and restraint in the metal, while beyond it the figure remained seated with an unsettling calm, as if the conversation itself had become a rare event rather than a passing moment. She slowly exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath without noticing, and adjusted her stance to ground herself in the cold stone beneath her boots. "That depends on who is asking," she repeated softly, not as a question but as a reflection, trying to understand the shape of those words rather than respond to them directly. There was a brief pause before the figure shifted slightly, his presence still controlled but no longer entirely withdrawn, and she noticed how the faint light from her lantern seemed to respond differently now, catching details she had not seen before in the shadows around him. "Then I suppose I am asking," Emily said gently, her voice steady but cautious, as if stepping into deeper water without knowing the depth. The air between them seemed to change at that moment, not warmer, but more focused, as though the dungeon itself had narrowed its attention to the exchange taking place. The figure remained quiet for a long breath, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a subtle shift, less distant than before. "Most who ask do not understand what they are asking for," he said, and Emily nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that without feeling discouraged by it. She lowered herself to sit on the cold stone floor near the gate, placing the lantern beside her so the light would remain steady, and she drew her knees slightly closer in a posture of patience rather than caution. "Then explain it to me," she said simply, her words carrying no demand, only openness, and for a moment even the faint ambient sounds of the dungeon seemed to soften in response. The figure beyond the gate tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that felt less like scrutiny and more like careful consideration, as if her presence required interpretation rather than reaction. "Explanation requires trust," he said quietly, and Emily considered this, realizing that trust in this place was not something easily offered or received, especially between two beings separated by iron and silence. She glanced at the water she had brought, still untouched, and then back toward him, noticing how he had not moved closer to it even once, as if accepting aid was a concept he had not fully decided upon. "I did not come here to demand anything from you," she replied calmly, her voice steady and sincere, and in that moment she felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable, like a thread being gently loosened rather than pulled. The figure exhaled slowly, a sound that carried more presence than words, and when he spoke again, there was a faint softness beneath the restraint. "You should not remain here long," he said, not as a dismissal but as an acknowledgement of consequence, and Emily looked at him more directly now, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful. "Then I will not stay long," she answered, though she made no immediate movement to leave, and in that contradiction a quiet understanding began to form between them, fragile but undeniable, as the dungeon continued to hold its breath around a conversation neither of them fully understood, yet both seemed unwilling to end. The faint echo of her own voice lingered longer than expected in the cold stone corridor, and Emily Carter realized that she had become attuned to the rhythm of the dungeon in a way she had not anticipated. Each step she took measured and deliberate, every movement reflecting her growing awareness of the presence beyond the iron gate. The figure shifted again, and this time Emily noticed the slight lean forward, a gesture that suggested attentiveness rather than impatience, and it gave her a strange sense of balance, as if her courage was acknowledged without words. She knelt once more beside the lantern, careful to keep the light steady, and adjusted the water bowl slightly so that its reflection caught the shadows across the gate in a subtle pattern, revealing details in the stone that had previously escaped her notice. "I cannot imagine what it has been like for you, confined in this place for so long," she said softly, her tone gentle but filled with honest curiosity, and the figure's eyes flickered in a way that suggested a quiet consideration of her words, the faintest acknowledgement of understanding that needed no further expression. She traced a fingertip along the edge of the gate, noting how the cold iron contrasted with the warmth of her own skin, and the juxtaposition reminded her that presence alone could convey meaning beyond language, especially in a place as charged with silence as this. The figure finally spoke, deliberate and slow, as if each word carried weight. "Time bends differently for those who wait," he said, and Emily considered the resonance of that statement. sensing layers of experience and endurance that were not immediately visible but could be felt through the careful cadence of his voice. She straightened slightly, her eyes meeting the faint glimmer of his gaze, and a quiet determination settled over her, the kind that does not shout but persists quietly in the background of every decision. Then perhaps it has been waiting for the right presence to arrive, she suggested gently, the words feeling like a bridge rather than a command, and the figure shifted again, the movement minimal but deliberate, as if accepting the possibility of her insight without needing to confirm it openly. Emily's attention drifted briefly to the markings on the gate and the patterns in the stone floor, ancient designs that seemed to pulse faintly in the lantern light, suggesting a history that intertwined with the figure's existence more intimately than she could have imagined. She leaned closer to the gate, keeping her voice soft and steady. "I did not come here for curiosity alone," she said, "but because I sensed that something needed care." There was a pause, and then a subtle shift in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that seemed to stretch through the stillness, a moment in which both presence and observer were aware of each other without the necessity of speech. "Care is rare," the figure said, a faint resonance beneath the words that hinted at appreciation, and Emily nodded slightly, feeling a sense of connection grow in the space between them, delicate but undeniable, as if each word and action was a thread weaving them closer in understanding. She adjusted her stance once more, drawing a deep breath and allowing the lantern to illuminate the space more fully, revealing cracks in the stone and the subtle play of shadows along the walls, while beyond the gate, the figure remained attentive, the quiet energy between them expanding in the still air, holding a promise of discovery yet to come and a trust that was building quietly, patiently, through gestures, presence, and the gentle unfolding of an unspoken understanding. The silence that followed their exchange felt different. Now, no longer uncertain or fragile, but steadier, as if the dungeon beneath Castle Blackthorne had adjusted itself to accommodate the slow unfolding of trust between Emily Carter and the unseen presence beyond the iron gate. Emily remained seated near the lantern, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes tracing the faint patterns in the stone floor while her thoughts lingered on the subtle weight of every word that had passed between them. She noticed how the air no longer felt as heavy as it had when she first arrived, and though the darkness remained unchanged, it no longer pressed against her senses in the same way. The figure beyond the gate shifted slightly, and Emily realized that even his stillness had changed, becoming less guarded, less distant, as if the space between them had begun to soften in ways neither of them had fully acknowledged. "You listen carefully," the figure said at last, his tone carrying a quiet observation rather than judgment, and Emily lifted her gaze toward him, acknowledging the statement with a calm nod. "I was taught that listening is the only way to understand what is not immediately spoken," she replied, her voice steady and measured, and there was a brief pause before he responded, as if considering her words with unusual depth. "Most people do not listen in places like this," he said, and Emily allowed a faint, thoughtful expression to pass across her face, understanding the implication without needing further explanation. She adjusted her position slightly, resting one hand on the cold stone beside her while the other remained near the lantern, ensuring its light did not waver, and she found herself more aware of the subtle details around her than she had been earlier, from the faint moisture on the walls to the quiet echo of distant space beyond the gate. "Then perhaps most people never come close enough to hear anything meaningful," she said gently, and the figure gave a faint exhale that carried the suggestion of agreement rather than dismissal. There was a long pause, one that stretched comfortably rather than awkwardly, and in that pause Emily felt something shift again, not in the environment, but in her perception of it, as though the dungeon itself had become less of a barrier and more of a shared space of awareness. The figure leaned forward slightly once more, and this time Emily noticed that his presence felt less like something confined and more like something restrained by choice or circumstance, though she did not yet understand the difference fully. "You are not afraid," he said quietly, and Emily considered the truth of that statement before responding, realizing that fear had been present when she first descended but had gradually been replaced by something more complex, a careful curiosity grounded in observation rather than assumption. "I do not think fear is always the first response when something does not feel harmful," she said honestly. And as the words left her, she realized how natural they felt in the quiet space between them. The lantern flickered slightly as she reached to steady it, and in that brief moment of movement, the light cast a shifting glow across the gate and the figure beyond it, revealing subtle contours that suggested patience, endurance, and something far deeper than silence. "Then you are rare," he said after a moment, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that lingered in the air, not as praise, but as recognition of something unusual. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, considering how to respond, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a calm sincerity that matched the stillness around them. "I am only someone who chose to stay long enough to understand what I found," she said, and in that moment, the distance between observer and observed felt less defined, as if the boundary itself had begun to loosen without either of them needing to acknowledge it directly, and the dungeon held that quiet realization in its depths like a secret waiting patiently for what would come next. The dungeon no longer felt like a place of punishment or secrecy, but instead like a suspended moment in time where every breath carried meaning, and Emily Carter found herself more aware than ever of the quiet exchange unfolding between herself and the presence beyond the iron gate. The lantern beside her burned with a steady, golden glow now, its light no longer trembling, and she noticed how even the shadows seemed to settle into a calmer rhythm, as if responding to the stability that had formed between them. The figure remained still for a long moment, and Emily sensed that something in the atmosphere had shifted, not abruptly but gradually, like a door opening that had not been touched in years. "You are still here," he said at last, and there was no surprise in his voice, only a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than simple observation. Emily lifted her gaze toward him, her expression calm and steady, and she offered a faint nod. "I said I would not stay long," she replied gently, "but I also said nothing about leaving immediately." There was a pause, and then the faintest sound that might have been a restrained exhale came from beyond the gate, as if the words had reached something deeper than intended. She shifted slightly, resting her hands more comfortably beside the lantern, and noticed how the cold of the stone floor no longer felt as sharp as it had earlier, as though her presence had subtly altered even her own perception of discomfort. "You think differently from others who come near this place," the figure said, his tone quieter now, more reflective than analytical, and Emily considered this carefully before responding. "I think most people decide what something is before they understand it," she said, her voice calm and precise, and the words seemed to settle into the space between them without resistance. The figure tilted his head slightly, and Emily noticed how even that small movement carried a sense of measured restraint, as if every action had been refined by time and circumstance. "And you do not?" he asked, and the question felt less like inquiry and more like a test of perception. Emily took a slow breath, her eyes briefly scanning the gate, the worn stone, and the faint symbols that seemed to shift subtly in the lantern light. "I prefer to understand before I decide," she answered simply. And in that moment, she felt a faint shift in the atmosphere again, something almost imperceptible but undeniably present, like recognition forming where none had existed before. The figure remained silent for several seconds, and Emily did not interrupt it, allowing the silence to stretch naturally, no longer uncomfortable but shared. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less guarded and more deliberate, as if he had chosen his words with greater care. "That is uncommon," he said, and Emily nodded slightly, accepting the observation without attaching meaning to it beyond its truth. She leaned back a little, still close to the gate but no longer pressing forward, and allowed the lantern light to illuminate more of the surrounding stone, noticing how the dungeon seemed less oppressive now, almost like a forgotten chamber rather than a place of confinement. "Uncommon does not mean impossible," she said softly, and the faintest pause followed, one that felt less like distance and more like contemplation. The figure shifted again, subtly closer to the gate than before, and Emily realized that the space between them no longer felt like separation alone, but like a threshold neither of them had yet decided to cross or abandon. "Then perhaps this place is not as empty as it seems," he said quietly, and Emily's gaze softened slightly as she listened, sensing that something unspoken was beginning to form beneath the surface of their exchange, something neither of them fully named, yet both were beginning to recognize in the quiet continuity of their presence. Emily Carter felt a quiet shift in the dungeon air, a subtle acknowledgement that the time they had shared in silence and careful words had created a bridge neither of them had expected, and she realized that the space between them no longer felt defined solely by the iron bars of the gate, but by the unspoken understanding that had grown steadily in the shadows. She moved slightly closer, keeping the lantern steady, and noticed how the figure beyond the gate had also shifted, a minimal movement that carried the weight of recognition rather than command, and it made her feel a quiet reassurance that their connection, fragile as it was, had become mutual. "I think we have both been waiting longer than we realized," she said softly, her words filling the stillness without breaking it, and the figure responded with a faint nod that was almost imperceptible but unmistakable in the dim glow. Emily allowed herself to observe the contours of his form more carefully, noting how the posture, though still restrained, suggested endurance and patience honed over a long time, and she sensed that the depth of his presence extended far beyond the surface of what she could see. "You are patient," he said, his voice carrying a subtle warmth now, and Emily smiled faintly, recognizing that the statement was not a compliment but an acknowledgement of shared steadiness, a quiet affirmation that their careful exchange had meaning. She adjusted the lantern slightly, letting the light illuminate more of the worn stone floor, the faint patterns etched into the walls, and the subtle interplay of shadows that danced along the ceiling, revealing details that had previously gone unnoticed. "Patience has its own reward," she replied gently, her tone steady, and the figure remained silent for a long breath, as if allowing her words to settle before offering a response. When he finally spoke, the voice carried a faint resonance that had not been present before, measured and deliberate. "Perhaps it does," he said, and Emily felt a subtle shift in the energy between them, as if the acknowledgement had unlocked something in the quiet rhythm of the dungeon. She remained still, absorbing the moment, noticing the soft flicker of the lantern against the iron gate, and feeling a sense of calm certainty growing in her chest, the kind that emerges when understanding is earned rather than given. "Then I will remain long enough to see what that reward might be," she said quietly, and she sensed the figure lean slightly closer without breaking the boundaries of the gate, a gesture of presence that mirrored her own intention and created a delicate balance of proximity and respect. The dungeon seemed to hold its breath along with them, the cold stone no longer oppressive but supportive of this exchange, and Emily realized that in the quiet, measured space between action and observation, a new possibility had begun to take form, one that required neither haste nor insistence, only the willingness to remain and understand. "You are remarkable," he said finally, the tone lighter now, infused with the faintest hint of admiration, and Emily allowed herself a small nod, feeling the depth of acknowledgement without needing to respond further. She stood slowly, keeping the lantern between them, and felt the weight of the moment solidify into quiet understanding, a bridge built of presence, patience, and measured words. And in that suspended time, both of them recognized the significance of what had passed, the subtle promise of discovery and trust stretching out before them in the still, illuminated space of the dungeon beneath the castle.